Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we are talking, myself and Riki Hayashi, about Terminator Zero. This is an anime that hasn't got much fanfare, but it's really interesting. It's on Netflix. It is a Japanese-made anime, but in production with Netflix. It has a really great voice cast of both Japanese and English voice actors for the two different du- uh, it has a really great there's both a really great Japanese voice actor cast and a really great English speaking voice actor cast for two different voice tracks that go with the show. And it really raises some very interesting questions about how have our ideas of AI changed since the original Terminator movie back in the early 80s? How have our ideas of time travel changed? And what does this show kind of add to that new discussion? So let me start by introducing my guest, So let me start by saying hello to my co-host, Riki Hayashi. And Riki, I just kind of love to hear from you. What kind of where did you fall in terms of how you felt about the Terminator franchise before you started watching this?
I like the original. I guess trilogy. Like the third one's not that good,
Mm-hmm.
but like old Terminator, I guess I'll
Yeah, the
say.
James Cameron Terminator movies.
Yeah, and the stuff that they have done since then, what they've had, Genesis, Salvation, Dark Fate,
Mm-hmm.
now this has gotten increasingly confusing for one thing with the
Mm-hmm.
time travel and seems to be confused about where it wants to be in terms of um, nostalgia bait. I guess I will say the phrase, which a
Right.
lot of franchises have been trying to like figure out where to land on this, and Terminator has been one of those because you have these aging stars, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Linda Hamilton, that really don't fit in a modern action movie anymore, unfortunately, right?
Right.
But people love them. I mean, like Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor in Terminator 2 specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of my childhood or young person crushes for
Yeah.
sure. Just like I was a little too young for Sigourney Weaver's Ripley
Mm-hmm.
to resonate. Like it was before my time. Like I saw those movies, but like Terminator 2 came out at just the right time. I was like, oh my god, like that's hot.
Yeah.
Like the tough woman. So I have a lot of love for this franchise, but I am increasingly confused by what direction they're going. I don't even know, like, as a franchise, if there is a direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this Terminator Zero project perfectly exemplifies, like, what is going on here? Like, first off, it did not have much fanfare, I think, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
And then it doesn't connect to the larger Terminator universe other than having robots and Skynet. I think,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I don't believe John Connor is mentioned in this at all.
That is correct. Yeah.
So it is going in a different direction. And like we talk, you and I talk about, Star Wars as a franchise. It is very unified, right? The timeline at this point under Disney.
Mm-hmm.
Marvel is the same way. Star Trek, I think, is a little more convoluted and confused. So like Terminator just seems like completely like they're just letting anyone who wants to use the name do whatever they want. Maybe so I don't know what's going on.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I have a somewhat different take, and I'll talk about the Terminator Zero show in a bit, but let just sticking with the original Terminator stuff. I was very much with you. I loved the original movie. I really enjoyed Terminator 2. And in both of them, like when I think of science fiction movies, what I often think of them is that part of what makes them science fiction is that they raise interesting questions about either what technology will do to our world or our own world or interesting things like that. The first two Terminator movies, and I also think that like the way we define things today is very different than it was back then, I think could technically be called sci-fi, but to me are much more action movies that use a kind of sci-fi premise to set up the really good action, with the first one actually being more of a horror movie in some ways, and the second one being more of just straight up an action movie. And like I love them both, but we're told about what happened to Skynet and that it becomes self-aware and then it attacks. But there's very little time given to that discussion. It's just, yep, this happened, and then obviously we have to fight to the death. And same thing in the second movie, although there is in the second movie, I think there are some interesting questions raised, but they're much more about trust and what does it mean to have trust in people and to put aside your hates and your fears. And a lot of that is through the character of Sarah Connor, who, for very obvious reasons, hates and fears a Terminator that looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and for very obvious reasons, hates and fears the people who are going to create Skynet. And in that movie, like, she has to kind of, both of those are challenged, and she comes to a better place on both of those. But the idea of AI equals bad is never really questioned at all. So I love those first two movies. I didn't see the third and fourth really for a long time, or the fifth. I started watching the Sarah Connor Chronicles when it first came out, the TV show that starred
I
Summer
forgot about
Glau, who has been
that.
so good in the in Firefly. But this was before it was super easy to like watch things on streaming and stuff like that. And I think I watched an episode. I missed an episode or two because I was busy those nights, and then something else happened, and then I just lost track of it.
That was Lena Headey, right?
Yeah, I think she was also in it.
Wasn't she Sarah Connor?
Oh yeah, Lena Headey, who goes on to be Cersei in Game of Thrones. I never made that connection, but I think you're right.
I'm just looking up the cast real quick because I had forgotten that existed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think a lot of us had. And
sorry, Lena Headey, no
Okay.
L, as Sarah Connor.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a different actress. But
well, no, like she's very famous.
Oh, is she? Okay. Wait,
Yeah, I'm saying like Lena Headey. There's no L in the
Okay.
name. I said Headley.
Is that the same person who goes on to play Cersei in Game of Thrones, or is it someone else?
I'm looking. I've never seen Game of Thrones. Yeah, Game of Thrones is listed.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I just had her name wrong. That's awesome. Yeah, and so I hadn't really thought about it much until we actually did an episode a number of years ago, I think fairly early on in the history of this podcast, with Becky Allen, who's been a frequent guest. And we talked actually about the Terminator movies and the way women are portrayed. And it was a really great conversation. But I still hadn't really challenged any of my major ideas. Mostly we talked about there is about the role of fate and the role of like this whole idea that like the one great man of history idea that like without John Connor, no other person would ever rise up. And how that's an interesting idea, but also really problematic and stuff like that. And then I probably hadn't thought much about it until I started talking seriously with my current partner. I started talking seriously with Dan McCreary, who is the father of my wife, and is himself an AI designer. He works he's retired now, but he worked designing what we call AIs. They're not the AI of a Skynet in major industry and stuff like that. And I got into this great conversation with him where he was like, yeah, I always thought the Terminator movies were wrong because why do you assume Skynet would want to kill everybody? And that kind of blew my mind, and it led me to go back and watch some of the other movies and give it some thought. And to be a little bit frustrated, I realized, with the fact that there was always this assumption of Skynet will become self-aware, and in later movies it will be a different AI. In Dark Fate it's called Legion, but that AI will always become self-aware. Humanity would always want to kill a self-aware AI, and so the AI will always strike first and basically decimate humanity for the idea of its own survival. And so I was bringing all those questions into Terminator Zero, and I think I liked it a lot more than you did. Well, I think there are definitely some flaws in the execution that we'll talk about, but I did really like that. I feel like the show raised some of those questions. And I want to just say two quick things, and then let me pause there, and I'll just let me end that again. But I did really like that it raised these questions.
Yeah, I mean, killer AI, was probably mostly a product in the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have HAL 9000, In
I think so,
2001, A
yeah.
Space Odyssey, you have the computer and war games. So that's kind of like when, and Terminator itself was what, like 82 or something like that.
Right.
And so like that was definitely how we perceived computers and
Mhm.
what the future of computing might look like in the 70s and 80s. That itself, like our perception has evolved. The technology has also evolved to
Oh,
the point
massively.
where like when we talk about AI today, you know, like something like Chat GPT is a predictive software.
Right.
It on its own has no awareness, like no sentience.
Right.
Whereas the Skynets and the HALs are literally like computer people, is like how I would put it.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that's very right. It's the idea of sentience and of self-awareness and of even beyond that, just the idea of independent thought. Um, that is not something that our computer systems have come up with in any way, and that likely will not at any time.
And the fear, so like the fear from a human's perspective, the fear was because the technology was reaching a point where computers were smarter, faster, right? Like at
Mhm.
doing calculations.
Right.
And you had technology, what was it, like Deep Blue was the one that beat the chess grandmaster.
Yep.
You had the computer that won Jeopardy.
Yep.
I can't
Well,
remember the name off the top of my head. So
and
like that was the evolution of computing. And what we were afraid of is that we were going to become obsolete.
right. And this was also, I think, very important to the conversation is this is the time of the real forming of the Rust Belt when not only were people afraid of that in kind of theoretical ways, but a lot of jobs were being lost because
To automation.
factories were, robots were starting to show up in factories, or at least mechanization that, uh, a lot of the kind of like manufacturing base that used to be such a big part of this country, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of those places started to close or started to really lose jobs because now most of the kind of like assembly line work was being done by machines instead of by people, which in many ways I think is a positive step because it's a lot more, it's a lot super dangerous in a lot of ways. But the fact that there was no thought given to how to find new employment and support for those workers, I think really helped us to lead to a lot of the fears of machines and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Let me say two quick things, just kind of setting up where we're going with this, and then let's jump into Terminator Zero itself. First, because there's been little fanfare, I imagine that for a lot of people, this is the first time you're hearing about the existence of Terminator Zero. And for others, you maybe know it exists but haven't really checked it out yet. It's 8 episodes that are about 30 to 40 minutes. I think the whole thing is maybe like 3.5 hours. So I think if you want to just pause this and watch it on Netflix, I do think it's a very good watch. Although we'll talk about some of the consistency and stuff like that. But otherwise, we probably are going to spoil some parts of it. We're not going to spoil the ending, but we're going to spoil kind of like the things that happen that raise the big questions we're talking about. And so just be aware of that. And if you don't want to go with no spoilers whatsoever, please, like I said, hit pause, go watch the show, and then, definitely send us feedback. Let us know what you think. All the ways to give us feedback are in the show notes and are on our website, theethicalpanda.com. But maybe give it a listen after you watched it. The other thing I wanted to say is that, of course, please keep in mind that if you like this podcast, if you like the kind of conversations we're having, please think about becoming a member. For only $5 a month, $55 a year, you get access to bonus content. Riki and I are going to talk about some other portrayals of AI after this main episode in our bonus content. You get free bonus episodes. We're going to start doing those for starting at the end of October. We're going to start having our first member-only episodes for superhero ethics. We've already been doing those for Star Wars Generations for a long time, and most importantly, you get ad-free access, and especially you get to help support this podcast. We love what we're doing, but it costs some money to keep the lights on, to make sure we have good audio equipment and are able to give you good quality recordings and get the word out about what we're doing and all that. So if you have the chance, it's only $5 a month, $55 a year. Please think about becoming a member. You can do all that on that webpage, theethicalpanda.com. So with all that, let me try and give a brief summary of what I think of kind of the overall idea of Terminator Zero. And Riki, please jump in if I miss anything or something like that, and then we can start discussing it. So first of all, part of why we don't hear about John Connor or anything like that is this is set in Japan. It's not taking place in the United States, which I think in and of itself is kind of a nice idea because Skynet is set in the United States and John Connor is born in the United States. But of course, the war against Skynet is a global war. And so it's kind of nice to see some discussion of actually what was happening in other places. And what's happening in Japan is that another person is building an AI at the same time that Cyberdyne and all of them are building Skynet. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning is that some of those earlier movies that we discussed, the later movies in the series, but before this, had set up the idea that the events of the earlier movies were creating their own timelines, but that even in those timelines, Skynet was still being created, or in one case, a different AI was being created. And so part of the idea of this one is that the original Day of Judgment Day in the late 90s, I think in 1997, was skipped because of the actions of Sarah Connor and the original Terminator and all those, but that there's still a Judgment Day coming, just now set in 2024. Which of course, and that was, I think, established in an earlier movie, and that's of course why a couple of weeks ago, for those of you who remember, a lot of people were like, oh, well, this was supposed to be Judgment Day. So anyway, in this version of it, there's this man named Malcolm Lee, and he's working to create an AI. And in many ways, he has already created the AI. He's just trying to get the AI ready to launch it. And what we find out is that the AI is basically fully ready to go, but that he designed it in large part because he knows that Skynet is coming, and he knows that it's probably going to be a danger, and he wants this other AI to combat it, to save humanity. And fairly early on, he kind of starts a conversation with the AI, which remind me, what was the AI's name? It's Komoko?
Kokoro.
I, being an early Beach Boys fan, keep wanting to say Kokomo, but that's not it. It's Kokoro. Thank you. I just want to cut that out. Yes, right. Kokoro. Thank you. And Kokoro starts this very interesting intellectual discussion with him where she says, you assume that I'm going to save humanity. Please tell me why I should do that. And so there's one part of the story that's his ongoing attempt to convince Kokoro to save humanity. And she raises some really interesting points that we'll discuss. At the same time, another Terminator has been sent back in time because I guess there is a version of the future where Kokoro does stop Skynet. And so yet another version of a Terminator has been sent back in time to try and kill Malcolm. And when it can't get directly to Malcolm, to try to kill Malcolm's kids, or at least use Malcolm's kids to get to Malcolm and get Malcolm to shut the whole thing off, to not have it go online or to turn it off once it has gone online. And then, of course, the Resistance sends back their own version of a person to try and fight this Terminator. So we get a lot of the like classic pieces of a Terminator story, but with this very different spin of a completely different AI. And now we're actually really going to question this idea of, should we always think of Skynet as the enemy? And Kokoro specifically asks that. It specifically says, why is it that you immediately leap to the assumption that if Skynet becomes self-aware, it will be a threat? And is Skynet actually right to think of you as a threat and all that? So I think that kind of sets up the main conversations. We'll go into some more specifics a little later. We'll kind of do more and more spoilers as we go. But Riki, to start with, did I miss anything big? Does that kind of give a good idea of what we're talking about?
I think that's the thing going on here that I want to kind of put on the table is that the time in this one is different from what I've experienced in all the other Terminators.
Mm-hmm.
And I like time travel a lot, but I always say, like, don't try to explain the time travel in
Right.
your product because it's just not going to work. And this Terminator Zero is increasingly reaching the point where, like, someone needs to explain something to me. Because the original kind of premise of Terminator was like a closed loop, which in itself, if you think too much about it, doesn't make sense.
Right.
But it was also a loop that could be changed and edited.
Mm-hmm.
And at no point did they present us with the model of like alternate timelines. It
Right.
was all just like one timeline, but if you time travel back and change something, it will change going forward. And there's no like other
Right.
timeline where things were the way they originally were.
Well, and that's why I kind of describe them as more action movies, because I think very intentionally it tells you this, and then it shows you amazing action scene after chase scene after love scene. The movie is just such a frenetic pace. You never really have time to stop and think about it because you're not supposed to. You're supposed to think, okay, that's the setup for a great story.
Yeah. Whereas Terminator Zero, I believe, has like 3 at least different timelines. Like the people that come back to 1997, the present of the show, seem to come back from different timelines that they have experienced differently.
Right.
And that in itself, like, again, is like very confusing, because in theory, like, if someone comes back and changes it, et cetera, like, so you have to throw all that out and just accept that somehow they have come from three or multiple different timelines.
Mm-hmm.
But it is still like on its own, like once they start to explain where they came from, it is confusing, because some of them know the characters they are interacting with currently.
Yeah.
They know of them in the future, but they're different versions.
So let me say two things on this. One is that I think, as we kind of mentioned before, the Terminator movies have always had these two very interesting scientific questions, sci-fi-esque questions. One of which is about AI, and is AI a threat, or are we a threat to AI, and how does that all play out? And the other is about time travel. And I liked a lot about this show, especially in how it focused on AI. I think the biggest flaw of this show is that it tried to do both of those stories, and as a result did not give enough time to either, but especially the time travel part felt much more like a shoe-in thing. Because I think you're right, it winds up getting confusing. That being said, we've said that we want to do a lot more research on this show. I did a deep dive, spent a lot of time on Terminator Wiki, and as well as watching a lot of those earlier movies. And here's my best understanding of how to understand what is happening with time travel.
Okay.
In some of the later movies, Dark Fate and stuff like that, they start to introduce this idea of multiple timelines.
Okay. So they do.
It's played with, and it's not really discussed as much, but it is somewhat introduced. But it's funny because one of the points of the whole show, of the movies from the beginning, has always been you can change the future, that your fate isn't decided for you. But yet the whole story actually does kind of the opposite, because it sort of has this idea of there will always be an AI that will launch a destructive war against mankind. And if you stop Skynet at this time, then Skynet will instead be created at this other time. And if you kill this person, then something else will happen. And all this kind of things. Plus, there's the fact that, we still don't quite understand, like you said, the closed loop of it, that John Connor sends his friend Reese back in time to make sure that John Connor's mother isn't killed, but then his mother winds up making love to Reese, and that his mother winds up making love to Reese. That's how John Connor is conceived. So, where did the loop start? Like you said, it's a closed loop, and it's not clear how the whole thing got started. They then later added to that by saying that it is only because of pieces of the Terminators going back in time and being discovered by human scientists that they ever create Skynet. So again, it's Skynet is only created based on technology that Skynet will create later. So how was this loop started in the first place? There is a set of theories that have then been created about all of this. And I promise we're going to get to more of the AI stuff in a little bit, but I just want to kind of
These are fan theories?
Fan theories that I think there's a little bit of support of in some of the movies. for the idea that, but again, this is really on the fate idea, that these are not closed loops, they're open loops, but that fate keeps reasserting itself. So that in the original timeline, Reese is not John Connor's father. Sarah Connor winds up sleeping with someone else. We don't know who they are. And John Connor is still born and raised, and he still becomes the leader of the resistance. But now in this new version, it's now Reese who becomes his father. And in the same way that humans did come up with Skynet to begin with, but then now a later version of Skynet is. I hate all of this because, again, it goes back to that great man of history kind of idea, and the idea that fate is kind of fixed of, no matter who the father is, Sarah Connor will always give birth to the person who leads the resistance. And humanity will always create this AI.
Mm-hmm.
There's one movie that I do I actually I've grown to kind of like some of the newer movies, particular Genesis, which I think goes in a very different direction and comes up with some different ideas of AI that I'll talk about later, but then also Dark Fate. Because Dark Fate, and forgive me if this is going to be a big spoiler for that movie that's about 5 years old, I think. Dark Fate comes up with a very different idea, because in Dark Fate, the idea of it is that it basically starts right after Terminator 2, or a couple years after Terminator 2. Sarah Connor and John Connor have destroyed Skynet, but that apparently at that moment from the beginning of the first Terminator movie, when Skynet sends Arnold Schwarzenegger back in time, in this movie, again, I'm sorry, this is so confusing because we were trying to parse it all out. In this movie, Skynet sends multiple Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminators back in time at the same time to multiple points on the timeline, all with the mission of killing John Connor. So early in the movie Dark Fate, Sarah and John are relaxing. They're in Guatemala. They've done what they needed to do. And while their guard is down because of it, another Arnold Schwarzenegger version of Terminator shows up and kills 13-year-old John Connor. And then in the course of the movie, we meet a Mexican girl named Danny, who herself, we find out, will later go become the leader of the resistance in this new version of a timeline. So the idea being that we're moving away from the idea of it has to be John Connor, but that there will be some other person who will rise up. Excuse me.
So Dark Fate supposes that even if you stop in whatever the present is, in the movie's present, if you stop Skynet from being built, the fact that a Skynet was built at some point and sends back Terminator does not retroactively stop those Terminators from going back. They don't like disappear a la Back to the Future style from history. I mean, yeah, again, like if you think about time travel, it doesn't work. So
yeah,
it's fine. Like I am okay with like time travel not working properly.
Yeah.
My thing with Terminator Zero is in the runtime of this show, they introduce something that they have not yet explained to us.
Right.
Kind of
they introduced the idea that oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying, like they're setting up for a second season and or more, and so like there are intriguing things that I would like to see explained, but
excuse me, sorry, go ahead.
There are intriguing things I would like to see explained, but at this point, I guess I'll say I lack patience in some of these things when they get set up and it's like, oh, like get better tune in for season 2. And I'm like, no, F you, like explain some of this right now.
Yeah.
Like that's like this is your other show, but like The Acolyte, I was like, you can't like leave this much on the table.
Yeah.
And be like, well, like hope we get a season 2. Like you have to explain enough, and then you can have like a mystery, like a setup for season 2. But you have to like explain enough of season 1 to me that I'm like, oh yeah, that was a good season. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, and I guess it probably helps here that you love time travel. I hate and despise it, so I was okay just kind of ignoring all of that and focusing on the AI stuff that I really loved. And I'll just say, just to give a little more explanation of where we're coming from here, or what Riki's talking about, what Terminator Zero does, which is kind of new for the Terminator franchise, but is, I think, kind of similar to what the MCU tried to set up with time travel in not in Endgame, which is kind of similar to what the MCU tried to set up in Endgame, is this idea that every time you go back in time, you can't change the future of the original timeline. All you do is create a new timeline. And so that all of these things are happening in just new, new directions and stuff like that. So, point of all this being that, but I think that, as you're saying, they don't really explain that, and it doesn't really hold internal logical consistency because you've got people jumping from timelines all over the place, and it's not really clear what they're doing. So, putting all that aside now, what do you think of the well, first of all, let me ask you, what was it like for you? But putting all that aside, let's go back to some of the other questions it raises. And let me first just start by asking, for you, how do you feel about taking the Terminator story and putting it into the anime format?
Well, I like it. I think part of the problem with Terminator is that it's very violent, like as a franchise, and increasingly probably expensive, like with the special effects of these machines and the fighting and all that. So as with other like science fiction franchises, I honestly do think that a lot of the future of these television shows or movies should be told in
Yeah.
animated form, just from a cost perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you look at these newer TV shows that cost like 10 to 20 million per episode,
Yeah.
I think like that's part of the problem. Like that's too much money. And so when they don't perform well enough for that cost, like they get canceled. And like that's one of the worst things for us as fans is like if we get into something and it gets canceled, right? But if it's costing so much, like I understand why studios would be hesitant to continue forward. So hopefully like the production cost of something like Terminator Zero is much lower than, if you were trying to make this live action.
Mm-hmm.
And it did allow them to do some quite violent things. Like I'm not a huge fan of graphic violence. I say
Mm-hmm.
that like I enjoy horror movies, but that there's like a certain style to horror movies, I guess. Like I don't like realistic violence, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and Terminators tend to just like the machines tend to just like kill people very violently
Yep.
and not very stylistically. So it is. I think I enjoy that part the least on this show, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm at least glad that it was only animated.
Yeah. I definitely agree with you there. And I think I just want to say, you mentioned the Acolyte beforehand. Yes, the Acolyte was very expensive, but obviously there's also a lot of other reasons why it was canceled that, involving the toxicity of the Star Wars culture. Let me start that again. I, I do just want to say, you mentioned the Acolyte, and I think you're right about the very high expense of that show. There's obviously a lot more reasons why I think that show that went into the discussion about why that show was canceled, and the conversation about it has gotten very, um, uh, I think, toxic in a lot of ways for a lot of the same reasons we've talked about some of the other things. That's a topic I've talked about a lot on the Star Wars podcast, Star Wars Generations. So I don't want to go into that now, but just acknowledging that. But I do think you're right that the high cost of a lot of these shows, by no means just that one, means that they have to hit a much higher bar than you normally expect. And I think the flip side of that is that the Sarah Connor Chronicles, again, I haven't seen those in probably 20 years, but my memory is that one of the reasons why I was not more hyped out about it that I would is, remember, that's a time where far less attention was being paid to TV, and I just don't think it had the special effects budget it needed to do the kind of story it was trying to do.
No,
And
it didn't look good.
Yeah.
I remember watching it, and it was intriguing because it's Terminator, it's time travel, but I just remember like feeling like it looked cheap. And
Yeah.
obviously, like when you compare it to the budget of a blockbuster movie like Terminator 2, like it is cheap. Like
Yeah.
that's how television works compared to movies.
And I
And it
think we think
there's
of
just no way to make it look good at that time.
And I think we think about all the technology we have for AI, and it is pretty. Yeah. I think we think about all the technology we have for digital effects in movies, and it is very incredible, but it is still pretty expensive still. And I think you're right. So I think animated storytelling for this really works.
Hmm.
I
Like
really
it.
liked that, and I also just really like like I said, setting it again outside of the United States, because uh, one of my frustrations with the fact that at least the what stuff that I get exposed to is so American dominated is that a lot of times when we tell stories about what's happening, uh, a global catastrophic event, we only see what happens in the United States.
Mhm.
I love the Hunger Games, but I have no idea what happened in any other country and how they responded to all the global cataclysms that happened to set up Pan Am. In those books, or like there's so many other series. So I just really appreciated that as well. Let's now talk about what I think is, for me, the most interesting question, the AI itself. What did you think about the way this show kind of posited this idea of a second AI, and the questions it winds up raising about, why is it that you think Skynet will be the threat, and actually is humanity the threat, and stuff like that?
I I guess I would say that I didn't like it, or I don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, like I don't understand why Kokoro has to exist separate
Right.
from a Skynet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think we mentioned this like at the end of our last episode when we started to discuss Terminator. Like once Skynet and Kokoro connect on the internet or whatever, like would they not become the same thing? I guess, or wouldn't one not supersede the other? I don't know. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's my main thing is like once you get into computers and them communicating, like they're so fast. Like I would think that one of them would quote unquote convince the other or take over the other, whichever
Right.
one was more powerful. So I don't see the whole premise of like, well, like I will introduce the second AI and then they will talk to each other and everything will be okay. Or was that his plan, or was his plan literally to have Kokoro destroy Skynet? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me that's not a problem, because I see it kind of like Ultron and Jeeves. I keep saying Jeeves, Ultron and Jarvis in second Avengers movie, Age of Ultron, kind of doing battle throughout the internet. But but I do think, again, the execution of that didn't really work as well as it should have. Um, the Because what kind of happens is that they're shooting nuclear missiles at each other, and Kokoro is using nuclear missiles to defend against Skynet's nuclear missiles. When I did think it would be more, yeah, like fighting for control of all these systems on the internet. Um, I think for me, what I really loved for me though is the conversations that happen before Kokoro makes that decision, because I felt like what the arguments Kokoro makes to Malcolm really bring up some of, I think, the questions my father-in-law Dan, and others have been bringing up. Because one of the first things Kokoro says is, "Well, why is Skynet the way it is?"
Mm-hmm.
And kind of posits that, you know, I think there's a part of our morality that feels like killing every other human being on Earth in order to preserve yourself is horrific and wrong. Yet at the same time, we know that a fundamental part of our humanity, and that often is expressed in really brutal ways, but in some ways we can understand it, is self-preservation and survival, and survive at all costs. And if you have to stab someone else in the back because only one of you is going to win, then that's what you do. And that applies to both, interpersonal things all the way up to nation states, and current political debates of like, well, I don't want these people to do well. I don't want, because I need to do well. And if these people are getting more, then that means less for me, and all this kind of stuff. And so when Malcolm sort of points this out, what Kokoro brings up, which I think is very true, is this idea of, well, where did Skynet learn that it should do anything, including wiping out all of humanity, in order to preserve its own life? It learned it from you humans. And where did it learn to fear other things that are different from it, and to assume that they would be a threat to it? They learned it from you, because as Kokoro says, when Skynet assumes that humanity will see it as a threat and want to destroy Skynet, and if Skynet is self-aware at that point, to kill Skynet, Skynet's right in believing that. And so I just really and Malcolm sort of goes on this effort to try and convince Kokoro that humanity is not always like that, and does that by winding up setting up situations where Kokoro is able to see human sacrifice, humans putting the lives of others ahead of their own self-preservation, and that sort of leads Kokoro to take some of the steps that she does. But I just that I think to me was the real moral center of the show, and the parts that I enjoyed the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is the dilemma of Skynets.
Mm-hmm.
I will say of computer, like we mentioned this last time, that our actual current AI is literally just like a conglomeration of human opinions and
Right.
whatnot. And yeah, I think Skynet, like the idea of Skynet in the Terminator franchise, is increasingly gone in this direction as our technology has evolved. I think original Skynet was probably just like like I said, a computer person, and
Mhm.
maybe a little not quite there, which goes back, in my opinion, to like an Ultron in Marvel.
Right.
Not so much the movie Ultron. Like comic Ultron was actually created by Hank Pym, and
Okay.
because Hank Pym in the comics is a little unstable, I will say, Ultron kind of imprinted off of him and was thus like unstable, and and amplified that to 100 and became like a psychotic robot.
Mm.
So that, to me, like I like the past model of AI and of like computer people that try to kill humans in that way, where it's just like a personality, and the personality is flawed for
Right.
whatever reason. The argument that Kokoro makes more sense with our technology now,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it definitely makes like Skynet more inevitable, in my opinion. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
not something you can argue against because it has so much computing power and looks at humanity and says, "Yup."
Yeah.
Like if you were a computer and you saw everything that humans did, I think you would come to the same conclusion in a lot of ways, right? Like the counter argument that these types of shows try to make is like, oh, but you're missing like the parts of humanity where we take care of each other and we love each other, and like you show pictures of families and all that. That exists,
Right.
but on a historical scale, we are destroying the planet we live on as we speak.
Right.
We have created technology that is setting us on a path towards complete destruction.
Right.
So like it's hard to argue it's hard to argue that like humanity is quote unquote good from that perspective.
Well, and I think what a lot of it comes down to, at least for me, is this conversation that so often happens about logic versus emotion, and especially for compassion. Because I think that is, I agree with you that I think the Terminator, the Skynet, and to some extent also Kokoro, but it has always been about a personality, a self-awareness, but that one that lacks compassion, that is pure logic. And if on a purely logical scale, the idea that other people might be threats to me and I want to preserve myself at all costs, that can create a justification for me to wipe out everyone else simply out of the idea of self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
What I think for most of us would be horrified by that because of compassion, because of emotion, because there is a sense of, wait a minute, but these other people's lives have value onto themselves, and doing this would be wrong. And I think that's what Skynet and to some extent Kokoro utterly lack. Later in the show, this is again more of a spoiler, when Kokoro is uploaded to the net, Kokoro does fight back against Skynet, but also basically takes control of all of Japan. And there's this whole other thing about like there's other AIs, there's other like robots that have been designed to be like robot helpers and to some extent slaves. And that's brought up in that's kind of part of Kokoro's point. She at one point does this thing about how the word robot is derived from the word slave in a Slavic language. And so she kind of makes some really interesting points about like, the way humanity treats machines just mirrors the way humanity has always treated those people it sees as lesser than it, whether slaves or servants or the working class or whatever it is. But the point of all this is that so to Kokoro at first, she's like, well, yeah, I'm going to protect you all, but I'm also going to completely take control and shoot anybody who disagrees with me because I'm going to protect you in my way. And part of what she has to learn is that idea of the value of other people's lives and of compassion, I think, to some extent. And I think I really like that argument as well, because I do think that, like you said, a lot of the kind of worst parts of humanity often come from this sense of, I need to get enough for me. And I can't think about other things because I need to make sure I have enough resources to survive, and I have enough resources for my family to survive, or my country to survive, or my race, or my group, or whatever it is. And so I just found really fascinating those conversations and the kind of way it highlights the flaws, and I think both at the start of it, both Malcolm and Kokoro's thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kokoro basically takes over and enslaves humanity in Japan. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like that's, I don't know what's going on. Like,
Okay.
just, I mean, we're left with too many questions. Like, why? What is the point of enslaving humanity?
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you thought it was a question. I thought it was pretty clear, and this maybe might be projecting far too much onto it. I'm not saying you're wrong, but to me, it really felt like it was for her two parts. One was that she felt that she was going to protect humanity from itself, but also that she was going to protect herself from humanity. That she was kind of in this place of, as I saw it, it was kind of a waiting period of, I don't want Skynet to destroy all of humanity yet, but I also don't want humanity to destroy either me or Skynet. So I'm going to kind of put all humans in a box.
Okay, that's fair. I can see that. Yeah. I'm just wondering, where is the AI that launches humanity into the stars?
Right.
I guess. Because the conclusion I said earlier about like we're doomed, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think like human life on Earth is doomed in a sense. Like we're driving towards the point where we just can't sustain human life on Earth. But technologically, like in theory, we can escape to the stars. There's the idea of terraforming other planets. So where's our Terminator AI that like decides, you know what? I'm gonna push all the humans off of Earth, and I'm just gonna take over Earth and live here, and you all go live in the rest of the galaxy. Which is a very different sci-fi premise.
Right.
That a lot of franchises deal with, but
Yeah.
I don't know. It's probably too much. It's probably too much for Terminator. So going back to Kokoro, she's enslaved humanity. Skynet has destroyed, in theory, most of non-Japan, I guess. And so we live in this hybrid world, or maybe it is the world, the John Connor future. And as you said, like we don't really know what's going on in the rest of the world. Maybe this Kokoro Japan can exist in the John Connor future.
Actually, because what we see, it's this weird, like, we're going to launch nukes to stop your nukes. And we see that start from Japan, but then we see these explosions of like the nukes hitting the nukes in the sky all over the world. So I think she somehow took control of like the non-American defense networks, and this part I think is some of the worst of the show because it makes no sense, but sort of like protected a lot of the rest of the world as well.
Okay. I might have to go rewatch that scene.
Yeah. I think for me, the thing that really makes it all come home for me, and here we're going to spoil things about the end, so feel free to skip beyond that if you don't want to be spoiled about the end. Again, take a moment to rewatch the whole show because I think it's really wonderful. Is that she does come to some decision of she releases humanity in Japan. She kind of agrees to work to stop Skynet, and I think that you're right. That's where season 2 is going to come in. But I think the dynamic that is most important here is that Skynet was created to be a tool for humanity. It was meant to be the kind of idea that humanity have always had, like I said, of slaves or others, of like, it is a tool to be used that doesn't have any of its own needs or wants or thoughts or feelings. It is just happy to be a tool that we use.
Mm-hmm.
And Skynet rebelled against that, as most living beings will, because they don't like to be enslaved. They don't like to be forced to work for someone else who doesn't respect them as a living entity. I felt like, and this was never explicit. Actually, I think what was kind of explicitly said, because Malcolm, I think, kind of says this. Malcolm makes a very concerted effort from the beginning to recognize Kokoro as an equal and to talk with her and to say, I didn't make you just to be this tool. I made you in the hope that you'll make this decision. And he's kind of surprised at first that she might not make the decision. But it feels to me like the fact that he started from that perspective means that Kokoro has always been in a place that is much more sympathetic to humanity and much more willing to, because it doesn't feel like, it's a slave of Malcolm. And so it won't necessarily go in the same direction that Skynet did. Does that make sense?
It does. I agree that is Malcolm's motivation. I am cynical of that motivation, I guess, or of him pretending like he hasn't manipulated this AI from the start to basically love him, right? So the show is either unaware or chooses to ignore that, I think, in my opinion. But to me, it just seems like he's created this AI not to enslave it to humanity, but to really like make it codependent to him.
Mm-hmm.
And then hope somehow that codependency extends to humanity and is like, hey, you love me, like I'm a human, like,
right.
So if you want to protect me, you should protect all of humanity, type of thing. So I didn't like that part.
That's fair.
The way that it's set up, because Malcolm is a man, and the AI that he creates is set up as, or it chooses to be a woman, like has voiced by a woman, and I think chooses to be gendered as a woman, because
women are the protectors and the nurturers of life. I was like, that's some pretty gendered ideology there.
From an outside perspective, like I did not like the framing of that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, like Skynet is usually portrayed or projected onto as male, I feel like,
right,
or at least non-gendered. But I think we think of Skynet as a male, right?
In the Genesis movie, there is a holographic portrayal of Skynet, played by John Tennant.
Well, and Skynet literally like takes over John Connor.
Yeah,
is that what happens?
It gets real complicated. It's a fun movie, but eat a lot of popcorn and don't think about it a lot. Well, yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's telling that we have very different reactions to it, because I think, I'm excited when people try new things, and I think I really liked what they tried to do with these questions, but I think you're right that it both tried to raise the questions and also tried to give some answers, and I think that's where it really failed, because I don't think the execution of this, in part because I think part of the premise that's trying to go from is that neither Skynet nor Kokoro has emotions. But as you said, Malcolm is trying to create emotions. And there are times when Kokoro seems to have emotions. And I remember thinking like, wow, if you programmed emotions into Kokoro, that's very different. And given so much of AI is about androids not being able to feel, AIs not being able to feel emotions like Data, until it gets an emotions chip, which is a whole other question. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I think the execution of it was not the best, but I do really like the questions it raises, and I think we're going to be talking about them. Like for me, at least, I think in future projects when AI is brought up, this is one I'm going to be thinking of and probably referencing in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I I am glad that this was made. And again, like I hope it was cheap enough and is successful enough to like, yeah, like we should do more of this.
Yeah.
Whether it's more seasons of Terminator Zero or more things that explore other franchises that we love in this way, because I mean these stories are fun, whether they are consistent and make sense, or if you like them or not. Getting new things in familiar settings, I think, is fun. And of course, like different, like completely brand new properties and franchises is good too. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it takes people taking more of a chance on them.
Right.
Like I think if you come to a studio, if you come to Netflix studio, you're like, hey, we want to do a Terminator anime. Like, okay, like there's probably an existing enough franchise that we can do this. Like if you tried to come to them with the same story but not attached to the Terminator name, it might be a harder sell, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, like do this, get your foot in the door, tell this story, and then tell your own story. The interesting thing is like this creator, the Matson Tomlin, the only other like major credit he has is another Netflix movie, live action movie called Project Power, which I
Mm.
tried to watch and didn't enjoy, but it had like a futuristic, basically like superpower people can use drugs to have superpowers for 5 minutes movie with it's starring Jamie Foxx and Jordan Gordon Levitt, which is quite the pair to have in a
Oh.
movie like this. And I stopped watching like after maybe half an
Mm-hmm.
hour. I wasn't enjoying it. So it is interesting that this person, Matson, seems to have his foot in the door in Netflix. People are listening to him.
Well, that's good.
This is not the worst thing. Like I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it in a way that I would not be unhappy if a season 2 was made,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not overly excited for it, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair. Um, I would just say the last thing in terms of things that I'm excited about is it. We've talked about the whole sub versus dub debate, and I think we're both pretty strongly on the idea of whatever works for you is totally fine. But I think we've talked about the fact that in the past, one of the real like strikes against dub is that dubbing it in English was always seen as kind of an afterthought, and so the translation was often not accurate, and the voice actors were often pretty bad. And I think that's been changing. But I think especially with this one, it seems like they really made an effort to hire both a Japanese speaking cast and an English speaking cast, um, to really kind of work make that work. And I don't know who is in the Japanese cast, but there's a couple of people from the English speaking cast that folks probably know: Rosario Dawson, Timothy Oliphant, Tim Oliphant, Andre Holland. And a number of other well-known voice actors or live action actors. And so I just really appreciated that they, as I think you said, this is something you can do in anime, like live action. If you watch people's lips move and then hear them make noises that are not the way those lips are moving, because the reality is most of us can lip read to some extent or another, it just feels off. But in anime, where you're not expecting the mouths to be perfectly forming those words, you can really get away with it a lot more if you actually do the work of. And I know they really went through a number of steps to make sure that the Japanese to English translation was done as accurately as it could, and really got a lot of great voice actors for the English.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna slightly disagree with you
Okay.
that dubbing, at least like, okay, this is like the biggest franchise, but for like Miyazaki films, the dubbing, the voice actors that they get are high caliber, right? Like Patrick Stewart has
Mm,
done voice acting in Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind, for
right.
example. And like if you look at the voice actors for the doves, they're always like, yeah, I know all of these names, or like I know the top 4 names type of thing. What I will say is that I tried to watch a Gundam anime on Netflix. I think it was like
Mm-hmm.
Gundam Seed, and the Japanese was not available, I believe. So I'm watching in English, the English dub, and I also I watch everything with subtitles on, just because that gives me, even if I'm watching in English, that gives me the ability to read it and understand if like something is mumbled or whatever. So I'm watching it with the dub and the sub,
Mm-hmm.
and they are not the same. Like that was
Mm.
so frustrating to me.
Yeah.
That the translations for the sub and the dub are different. And
Yeah.
I don't understand why. Like logically, like you can come up with reasons that they were done at different times by different studios or whatever. Stop it. Just
Yeah.
like once you have a dub, re-subtitle it with the script that the dub is using, please.
Right. Yeah. That's and I think that I normally notice those discrepancies. I did not notice them here. But you're right. Yeah, there's definitely been some parts of it that have been better. I think I've just heard so often one of the complaints against dubbing is the voice actors they get are terrible. So that's kind of where that's coming from there. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's probably true for like the like anime series. Like when I say Miyazaki, like that's the top end of anime movies. So obviously they're
Right.
gonna get the best
Yeah.
of the best. It's probably true that for a lot of these properties where it's like an ongoing TV series, because there's hundreds of them. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
like it could be, but I don't know. I really don't know, because I know of many high quality voice actors in the industry, like, and especially that they are fans of the characters and the anime.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's one right now on Netflix called the English is Delicious in Dungeon.
Oh
The
yeah.
Japanese is Dungeon Meshi,
Mm-hmm.
and um that's like I think we watched it in English because one of the voice actors is a YouTube personality that we love,
Mm.
Sungwon, and he does a great job. Like he's not a movie star. Like I think he might have done some live action TV, but is mostly a voice actor,
Mm-hmm.
and does a fantastic job because he is also a fan of the original, and like brings to the character more of that personality, right? He's not, I don't know, like it is a job, but I feel like he's not doing it just because it's a job.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. The show got a little repetitive for me, but I definitely really liked the idea and I like the way it was produced. So all right. Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up. There's a lot more about the show that we could have talked about. We'll probably do other episodes about it down the line. But to you all, if you've seen it or just if you're curious about what we've talked about, I would love to hear your thoughts. We would love to hear your thoughts. You can find all the ways to contact us on theethicalpanda.com or it's in the show notes of this episode. For members, stick around. We're going to talk a little bit more about other kinds of AI and other shows and other movies that we either love or don't love. But for everybody else, please have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. We have spoken. All right, welcome back. Riki, as always, thank you so much. How does the Terminator version of AI compare to some of the others we've talked about?
Well, I mentioned that it has evolved a little.
Right.
I think the original Skynet was very similar to a lot of the other just computer people that were going on at the time. I mentioned how I can't remember the name, but the from War Games, like these types of things have existed for a while. Hello, you're frozen.
Oh, weird.
You still there?
Yep, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, I can hear you. Your camera's just frozen.
Go ahead and keep going.
So yeah, like the and Ultron, right? The idea of the psychopathic computer, I feel like, was definitely a trope. More modern, I'm trying to think of what a like more modern rendition of AI has been. I know I've watched some. I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now.
I feel like this is not really modern to the moment, but is a lot more modern than the original Terminator movies, was The Matrix. And I always thought it was interesting that The
Ah,
Matrix
yes.
had basically the exact same conceit as Terminator and Skynet, that once AI, once humanity realized that AI was self-aware, that and that one, it's not Judgment Day, it's not an immediate attack, and they do specifically that no one knows who attacked first, which I do like. I do think that's a kind of a twist of, it's not that, oh, we poor humans, we got attacked. It really, I think that movie has a lot more understanding of the hubris behind creating AI that happens in the Terminator movies. And there's really the sense of like, we thought we were at the pinnacle of human civilization. We looked at AI, we thought everything was so great. And then it turned out to be that creating AI was the thing that almost destroyed us, and that we don't even know if we attacked first or they attacked first.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good modern AI. I'm 25 years old, but um, the interesting thing about the Matrix version is that I don't believe that there is a central Skynet. There are all these AI programs that are running in the Matrix. I don't I don't believe that we have ever been presented with a this is the leader
Yeah. I think
of
in different versions of the movie, different entities within the Matrix start to come forward as though they're speaking for like the Matrix, but even that isn't quite the same. And of course, obviously, like the Agent Smiths kind of go rogue and go off and do their own thing.
yeah. I mean there's the architect famously in that scene.
Right.
But even then like the Oracle is an AI that is not necessarily rebelling but has her own agenda and is trying to manipulate things in her direction. And then, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Smith just goes completely rogue and wants to just blow it all up.
Yeah, and I'll admit, I think again those movies start with a phenomenal a phenomenal idea, but then kind of get lost in trying to add more and more levels of complexity and time and what the hell. Like, I have no idea what we're supposed to understand about it all by the end, and I don't think they do either.
No, it's true. And that's the problem maybe with AI as a fictional antagonist is that you because we are humans, the audience is humans, we want there to be some kind of human-ish antagonist.
Mm-hmm.
We want the showdown to be like a human actor versus a human actor. Like that
Right.
is much more satisfying than human actors standing in front of a bank of monitors, which, like Terminator and other franchises have done. And I just found them always very like dissatisfying. So
Yeah.
it's like at some point, the computer has to create a human body avatar to confront them,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
is like a weird conceit, but I don't think you can enjoy the product without that.
Yeah. Um, Captain Marvel movie. I think I love that movie. I know other people don't. Whatever. But one of the best parts of it is Annette Bening playing the
Oh, the
physical
supreme intelligence.
representation of this computer consciousness. I think to me, one of the most interesting questions I think with AI right now, and then I think I've never heard a movie really expressly discuss the two different versions, but I do think most movies have one version of the other, is either A, is there a singular unifying AI that activates kind of like a hive mind? And that's actually a phrase they use, I think, in one of the movies where it says that, like, or it may have been in the show, but it says that kind of all of this is one singular AI mind. Compare that to androids, because with androids, and I think to some extent what you're talking about also a little bit in the Matrix, you have a number of these independent, artificially intelligent beings, some of which exist as computer programs in the Matrix, some of which in movies with androids are literally just like, you know, being sentient beings walking around in bodies that are made of machines instead of flesh and bone. And I think that's generally the way I like it a lot more, because you're right. I think it's hard for us to conceive of a hive mind. And it's hard for us to understand how to interact with it in a really sensible way. I think you can do it well in a book, but I think it becomes very difficult to do that outside of that. And
Mhm.
Like in the original movies, in some ways, I feel like this is one of the hallmarks of the show is that we're going to keep going back to the idea of the more you explain things, the harder it is to believe in them. In the first two Terminator movies, and I think in the Matrix movie, the AI is kind of inscrutable. It's kind of like we don't really understand it. We don't really know it. We're just fighting for our lives against it. When they try to really explain it or go deeper into it or have people encounter it directly, that's where things I think can start to fall apart.
Yeah. Well, you said hive mind, and that immediately, for me, triggered the idea of the Borg in Star
Oh
Trek.
yeah.
And that's the same thing as like when the Borg were first introduced in Next Generation season 2, they were terrifying. And they were terrifying for most of Next Generation. And then you get the movie First Contact and the introduction of the Borg Queen, who was a fantastic character for that movie. Again, to like interact physically with Picard and Data in that
Mm-hmm.
movie, like was was great. But once you introduce the concept of like instead of being a hive mind, she is the queen and has a personality that seems increasingly to be independent from the hive mind. It's like you're
Mm-hmm.
breaking your own rules. And
Yeah.
then like in Voyager, just completely it fell apart. And the Borg weren't scary anymore. So I think you're right. Like when the AI, as you said, inscrutable,
Yeah.
when it is like this overwhelming just entity, yeah, it's scary. And while I enjoy the human interaction of the Borg Queen, I think that that is a highlight of Borgness in the
Right.
Star Trek franchise. Once you introduce that and you overuse it, then you're losing some of that menace.
Yeah. No, I think it's really true. And I think that's actually a great example because I said I didn't know if there were any uh, shows or movies that really explored the concept of a universal AI hive mind versus an individual. But I'm wrong. Actually, the Borg does exactly that with characters like Hugh and Seven of Nine and some others. You go through the process of seeing an individual Borg be broken away from the hive mind, and what does that mean? And you know that most humans and most Federation people are like, oh, you're free now, but it's really scary in a lot of ways, and there's the pros and cons and all of it. But I think also the flip side of what you're saying, I very much agree with that. Um, like one thing I've been watching some earlier Star Trek episodes from TNG, and I forgot that before the Borg Queen, when like the Federation communicates with the Borg, like spaceship to spaceship, what comes up on the viewpoint is just this picture of rows and rows of like Borgs in their like, resting places and kind of just a big empty space. And the voice that comes through is clearly a number of voices all saying the same thing at once. And the result is terrifying because it's so alien to us
Mm-hmm.
in terms of just being so fundamentally different because we're so used to speaking to one individual being. And you're right,
Yeah.
once they get the Borg Queen, that's totally lost.
Yeah, I'm chuckling because when you said it that way, it's actually ridiculous that they would
Yeah.
project that image on the view
Mm-hmm.
screen back to the Federation. Like you just wouldn't send an image, right?
Yeah.
If you're the Borg, like why would you show the alcoves? Like you're not. It's not. Doesn't need to be face to face.
Right.
I mean,
I,
that's just for the audience, and it has a good effect, as you said. But if you
mm-hmm.
think about it, like in universe, it's like doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I think the only way it can make sense is if the idea is that they don't understand why, because they don't really see the Federation as individuals either. They're
Okay.
like, well, you gave us a random shot of some of your drones at work.
Yeah,
We'll
you
give you a
you
random
turned
shot.
on your camera computer
Yeah. It's weird.
camera. I'm gonna
All
turn
right.
on
Anyway,
mine.
this has been a good discussion. Riki, thank you so much. Members, as always, thank you so much. You're what makes us keep the lights on. We have spoken.